Okay, I said I'd start at 5 past the hour. I think I will proceed now, and hopefully we will get a few more participants joining over the next 5 minutes. We have nearly 200 already, so I think that's time to start, so we don't keep you all waiting. First of all, can everyone see my screen? I always have a nervous moment here.
Yes, Mr. Thomas.
Okay, thanks so much. Right, welcome to the second APFIC webinar, the review of illegal fishing in the APFIC region. I am the Secretary of the Asia Pacific Fishery Commission. My name is Simon Funge-Smith, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to join all of you here today at this APFIC webinar. The Asia Pacific Fishery Commission, or APFIC webinar series, is our response to the limitations that have been placed on our work due to the COVID pandemic and the inability to meet physically, to have workshops where we travel and meet up and network. And this has constrained quite a bit of the formal process of our commission. But at the same time, it's been quite liberating because it's enabled us to also reach out and have the webinar series and reach out and get to a much bigger audience than we ever would have been able to through physical meetings. So the virtual approach is for us has been a great opportunity to be able to get the work of the Asia Pacific Fishery Commission out and the issues that we've been working on, get them to a much wider audience, particularly for our region. And this wouldn't have been possible without the assistance and cooperation of INFOFISH, who are partnering with FAO and APFIC to run the whole webinar series. So first of all, I'd like to express my great appreciation to INFOFISH for that partnership and helping us run these technical webinars. We had 500 registered participants at this webinar. Hopefully they're all coming in. We see there's nearly 200 of you now. And the registered participants came from across 21 APFIC member countries, i.e. all of the APFIC member countries had registrants. But we also had regional fishery organizations, MCS networks, NGOs, CSOs, private sector research. The main participation obviously is from Asia because that's where our focus lies, and also the timing aspect, but we have representatives and people coming from elsewhere in the world. We are recording these webinars. That means they can be viewed at a later date. Please share the links or share them with colleagues. We'll provide that link after this session is concluded. This webinar focuses on illegal fishing in the Asia Pacific Fishery Commission region. It's our second webinar, and it's here to review the findings of a study that was conducted in cooperation with CSIRO, between FAO and CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific International, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the acronym now. My apologies to CSIRO colleagues. Anyway, the research organization and for the Commonwealth, and they have worked with us to develop this study, which was an update of a previous piece of work that was conducted in 2015. The CSIRO team developed a more rigorous methodology, one that was replicable, and the idea was that it would be used to identify illegal fishing in the region. It is designed to get around the problems that we have with the fact that IUU fishing is hidden from view, is very limited documentation, and a general unwillingness to share information, and publicly at least, around the subject of illegal fishing. So we're going to be looking at the results and findings, the methodology. We're going to have a bit of a look and see how things might have changed over the past 5 years, and also some recommendations for action. The point of this is to be forward-looking, to look at the opportunity that we have in order to use this methodology in other situations, whether it's something that people and countries will want to pick up and work with further to look at their national issues, possibly regional issues, and to encourage greater communication and cooperation around this area. The webinar structure starts at 14:10 with the first presentation from Chris Wilcox, who's one of the co-authors of the review. And Chris will make two presentations, but he will split them. There will be a question and answer between each of his presentations. His first presentation will be an outline of the methodology that was used to estimate the illegal fishing. And then the second review is, or second presentation is the review of the main findings from the review. His colleague Sean Pascoe will then present on how the valuations were made to take the estimates of illegal fishing and then how those were turned into dollar values, and then what do those values mean and how do they line up with other studies that have been conducted. I will present the final technical presentation related to the review, which follows will present the implications and possible actions for the APFIC region. This is based on the conclusions and main recommendations that come out of the review, and it looks at where things might go and what we might do moving ahead. We then have a feedback session from three colleagues from regional organizations who I'd like to welcome. Pak Arif Hidayatollah from the Regional Plan of Action, Dr. Warawit Wanchana from Southeast Asia Fishery Development Center, and Dr. Yugraj Yadava from the Bay of Bengal Program IGO. These three will make a short presentation of their, from their institutional perspective about the results, about what that may mean to their organizations, but also perhaps some linkages to their own programs as well. We will then have a final Q&A session where we will be pulling other questions that have remained unanswered that come from the question and answer box, and that will be put to the presenters and panelists. And we will simply select questions that we feel are most relevant to the session. And so we would encourage you to put questions in there that you would like to have answered by the panelists and presenters. And that will run for about half an hour. So with that, again, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. Thank you very much for coming. And I would now like to hand over to the first presenter, which is Chris Wilcox, to give us the overview of the methodology. Chris, over to you, please.
Okay. Thanks, Simon. I assume everyone can hear me. I'll just switch to share my screen. How's that? Simon, can you see it?
We can see it, but you're in not in presenter mode.
Okay. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to talk briefly about a little bit of background and framing, and then the methodology we developed for this study. I want to thank Simon and FAO for organizing this. It's exciting to be able to talk to everyone about what we spent the last year doing. So I just want to mention at the outset that this study, in parallel to the FAO study that we were trying to update from 2016, is really focused on illegal fishing solely. So not the other two U's involved, just for clarity. And we were not really trying to dig deeply into domestic fisheries issues. So although we obviously collect data that touches on those, our focus was not in allocating estimates really to countries. So with that, we'll start. Just in terms of reiterating the goals that Simon mentioned, that the project really started with 3 goals: design and deliver a repeatable, transparent, and cost-effective approach for estimating illegal fishing in this case applied to the APFIC area of competence, and to some extent touch on responses to illegal fishing and changes since the 2015 estimate. We developed 3 case studies illustrative of the issues in the region, and then finally we delivered the data, results and data in the context of human ethics requirements. Obviously, whenever you're working with human subjects, you need some ethics approvals to do that. So, estimating IUU fishing in the region. So just by way of background, there are probably 3 recent estimates of IUU more generally that are worth being cognizant of. There was an estimate from the Bay of Bengal LME project in 2015 that started out really just trying to cover the countries that were relevant for that IGO, and in the end expanded to include many of the countries in the APFIC region. There was a project sponsored by the Foreign Fisheries Agency, obviously that manages tuna in the Pacific Island regions. That was implemented by MRAG in 2016, but it touches on the edge of the APFIC region. And then finally, the previous report that was prepared by FAO and delivered to APFIC in 2016, which we're effectively updating. In terms of these 3 efforts, the methodologies differ fairly significantly. The BOBP and FAO primarily review documents and media reports. So they're essentially based on publicly available data. The FFA analysis really dug down into traditional fisheries data, so VMS, landing records, and was much more down in actual primary data that would typically be held by countries. There were also some differences in the approaches to transparency, repeatability, and handling of uncertainty. The BOBP and FAO assessments both essentially were done by a small group of experts. So as Simon alluded to, well, there's no necessary problem with that. It makes transparency challenging because it's hard to document that decision-making process. And it's also hard to make it repeatable. You have people making a set of decisions about how to evaluate evidence, and there's no fixed process. FAO estimates differ, basically came direct from documents, and the BOBP essentially upscales from FAO catch data. So it's based on an anchor point methodology that was developed in the early 2000s, which has had some controversy in various places, essentially around transparency. By contrast, the FFA method is transparent and repeatable, although given the depth of analysis of data, it is fairly complicated and thus would be difficult to, challenging to repeat even in FFA with the same data because of the lead-in process of getting the data ready. But it would be very difficult to transfer to a context like APFIC, where essentially the body who's doing the work doesn't have access to things like the MS data. Okay, so in terms of thinking about these previous estimates within the APFIC context and the area of competence, not just generally, really 2 of the estimates overlap the APFIC area of competence. The BOBP includes about 15 APFIC members, and obviously the FAO RAP report includes all of the members. Just to give you a sense, if you're not aware of these 2 documents, the BOBP estimate was something like 4.5 to 14 million tons, and this is only the illegal component of their estimate, and something like $6 to $21 billion USD annually in illegal catch. They noted a couple patterns, which we also saw. Estimates were higher in countries with weak control or with shared boundaries with other countries that had large fleets. So that's just a quick summary of the outcomes. The FAO RAP report in 2016 is somewhat different in that it really focused on hotspots in the region, which we'll come to later. And again, as we did, focused solely on illegality, so not on IUU. The hotspots they made an estimate of volume and value for those hotspots. So about 2 to 2.5 million tons across 33 hotspots are identified, and about 3 to 5.2 billion USD per year. In the meantime, since those studies have been done, FAO has been developing guidelines for estimating IUU fishing. The guidelines are for IUU more generally, but obviously apply to the illegal component. So FAO in 2015 did a large global review of all the studies that estimated IUU. And then in 2018, based on that global review, they put out some draft guidelines for estimation. So what you see on the right there is volume 2, which gives the guidelines for estimation. And that's a picture of the FAO website where you can download those. Forthcoming will be volume 3, which will talk a bit more about implementation. And I believe this APFIC work will likely be featured as one component. So a couple key features in the technical guidelines that really guided our project were they had a large table of approaches. So depending on what data is available, what kind of illegality you're interested in, different approaches that you might take. And then they also had a general set of design principles for estimation studies. In the end, the context in the tables did not really apply to APFIC for a number of reasons. Largely, it's across many species, multiple countries. There's no primary fisheries surveillance and monitoring data available, and the scope of the study was limited, so it needed to be done relatively quickly for relatively modest cost. So rather than try to shoehorn the APFIC project into one of the defined approaches, we basically designed a new approach, but following those design principles put forward by FAO. One of the key challenges that FAO outlined was really keeping detail in a study as you target larger scope. So larger scope in terms of coverage of the number of species or the number of types of violations or the number of countries. And obviously in this case, we're talking about many, many species across many countries and many violations. So we have quite a large scope. And so I think it's well worth thinking about this question about how to maintain detail in what you're doing so that you can actually drill down. Just to summarize the FAO principles, a few kind of key important ones. The methodology should be transparent. It should be data-driven. It should treat uncertainty in a clear way. It should be risk-based, which means you should be able to make probabilistic predictions about things that are going to occur or not. Stakeholder engagement is key. They obviously had other recommendations, but those are some of the really central ones. So thinking about bringing these FAO guidelines to the APFIC context, the FAO guidelines in that context, as I mentioned, detailed fishery monitoring data is not available. So we focused on the design principles, and we essentially extended a methodology that we had developed with colleagues for a project in Chile to estimate illegal fishing domestically in Chile. And that really focused around using a structured survey as one of the primary tools, with that survey being delivered to fisheries enforcement officers. So if you're interested, that's a picture of the headline from the scientific paper that was published about it that sort of lays out what was done in that context. In terms of connecting it to the previous APFIC report, there were some key targets we needed to hit. So the picture below on the bottom of the screen is the map of the hotspots identified in the APFIC report that was delivered in 2016. We needed to update those hotspots, so determine if they're still active IUU hotspots. We also wanted to, as Simon mentioned, illustrate how one might move from a somewhat ad hoc analysis of media data and other information to a more formal analysis. Obviously, we need to align it with the FAO guidelines. And then one of the key points in the FAO guidelines is really this idea of triangulating across multiple data types. So in our context, we had media and interview data, and we'd like to integrate that with the survey data. Okay, so just laying out the methodology more explicitly, we really had three components to our data collection. We used a structured survey. So as many people have seen, the sort of web-based survey that asks a whole series of questions. That was delivered to fisheries officers in countries across the region on the argument that, as Simon mentioned, illegality is going to be hard to observe. But the people, aside from the people that are committing the illegality, the people that are next most close to it are fisheries enforcement officers. And so if you want to capture knowledge about it, targeting them with a survey is probably the best you're going to get. We supported that with interviews with key experts in the region. And then finally, we did a large analysis of essentially popular media and gray literature across the region. The targets we had for this work were, first of all, to estimate the volume and value of illegal landings. Second, to characterize that illegality. So understand who's participating, what types of violations, what types of vessels, things like that. And then finally, as I mentioned, to update the mapping of the hotspots from 2016. Some key principles for us around the analysis is that we wanted to have robust statistical methods that can integrate these different types of data, control for biases. Obviously, when you start asking human beings questions, you bring all kinds of biases along with that, and then be able to represent the uncertainty in our predictions. So just walking through the survey as the first component of this data collection. It's an anonymous survey. It was delivered over the web. We first asked for respondents to select a region. So on the right in the top, you'll see a map that shows you 6 regions labeled A through F, I believe. And they would select one of those regions, and then the survey was tailored to that region. We very intentionally did not select country EEZs or anything like that. We attempted to steer towards large sort of marine zones that were roughly ecologically bounded with some overlap between them. Once they selected a region, there were 3 components to the survey. First, we showed them a list of 25 species that were specific to that region. We picked those based on high value and high volume landings, and also things that had specific issues with the illegality flagged in 2016. We asked people really 2 questions about each of those 25 species. How much experience do you have with that species? And then what level of illegal landings do you believe occur with that particular species? And as you can see, we used essentially semi-quantitative bins. So none, a little, less than half, more than half, almost all. Then we had a second component of the survey in which for each region, we identified 3 focal species that we were going to ask more detailed questions about. And then we asked the survey respondent to nominate a 4th species that they thought should be included. And for those species, those 4 species, we asked a set of more detailed questions about types of violations, issues relatively between small scale and industrial, bits of the supply chain and infrastructure that might be involved, to try to build a more coherent, informative picture. And then the third component, as I mentioned, involved mapping. So we had this map that you see in the lower right from the earlier FAO work. What we did was we first showed people that map focused on their region, but with nothing on it. It was blank. And they could select up to 20 locations with the mouse on their computer and click on those locations where they thought there were hotspots of IUU. And then second, once they did that, we then showed them the map below, and we asked them, for each of these pink hotspots in your region, tell us that whether you think it is still a hotspot, you don't know, you're uncertain, or whether you think it's no longer a hotspot. And so we basically collected a set of scores across all those existing, all those previously identified hotspots. We then put some effort into standardizing the survey data. This is one key thing that needs to be done whenever you ask people questions, which often does not receive adequate attention. And it's key because ultimately you want to figure out what the consensus opinion is, but you need to control for a few issues. So survey responses can vary for reasons unrelated to data, to the true thing they're trying to answer. For instance, and they stop paying attention to the survey as they get further down, lack of engagement or understanding, and in some cases, lack of knowledge. So they might just give you random answers. As I mentioned, correcting for these factors is important. And we really did two things to measure the level of engagement with the survey by the respondents. We looked at how they scored those first 25 species, and essentially, did they just score straight down the line? Or is there some variation between species? And that gives us some feel for whether they're essentially paying attention to what they're doing. And second, we compared scores for the level of illegality between that initial list of 25 and the focal species, because species appeared in both places. There was some overlap. And so if their answers were consistent, we also knew that they were relatively focused. With that in hand, we could include that in the standardization of the data. And we used essentially a set of statistical models of the survey responses. We use these sort of quality metrics to weight how much to trust each survey respondent. And we really focused on predicting kind of the consensus across respondents. From the first two sets of questions about the 25 species and then the focal species, we want to use that information to estimate a total volume of illegal landings. And we really do that by first estimating the fraction of landings that survey respondents are telling us are illegal. And then ultimately we're going to multiply that times the FAO catch data. So we first standardized the responses about the level of illegal landings. So if you remember back, I mentioned we have these bins: none, some, less than half, more than half, almost all. So we get rid of the effects of survey fatigue and bias and things like that with the statistical model. And then we need to turn those bins into something that's actually a number. And so if you imagine, those bins actually have some bounds in some cases as numbers. So none is essentially bounded by the numbers 0 and 0. And if you think of this as a proportion, all is bounded by the numbers 1 and 1. So the two bits that we needed to figure out is what is the bound between some and less than half. That could be anywhere in that space between 0 and 0.5. And then we needed to figure out what the bound is between more than half and almost all. And again, that could be somewhere between 0 and 0.5. What we did was we used the answers for the 4 focal species, where we actually asked people percentages to figure out, given that what they told us about those bins, what did they tell us about the percentages? And then we can essentially map how each person converts between the two. So with that in hand, finally, we can then multiply that times the FAO landing data to estimate the expected fraction that's illegally landed, rather. So with that in hand, we then went on to build a picture of the violations. And as I mentioned, for these 4 focal species, we gathered some more detail from the survey respondents about illegality around landings. So we selected 3 species per region that we specified in the surveys. The fisheries officer selects a 4th one to include. Just to give you a sense of the pre-selected species, they were skipjack, yellowfin, croaker drum, shark, grouper, and a few others. We had to balance being specific or being very narrow about the species names and things with providing people names that would be general enough that even if they're not deeply aware of biological nomenclature, they'd be able to answer. So obviously we work in common names. We translated these surveys into 5 languages. And then for each of these focal species, we asked a set of questions. What percentage of the landings are illegal? Do the violations that generate this illegality occur at national, bilateral, or international regulatory levels. Who's involved in the supply chain? So fishers, buyers, processor, exporter, wholesaler, retailer, and they can pick any one or all or some of those. And then finally, what is the type of infraction? So license infractions, gear, transshipping, encroachment, and then we allowed them to select another category. Again, we use statistical models to standardize the responses and to make estimates by species and by sector, so for industrial and small scale. Third, we wanted to update the map of hotspots. So on the right is a picture of all the clicks that we had across the fisheries inspectors that answered our survey. Obviously, a fisheries inspector or official can click in up to 20 locations. Sometimes they click one, sometimes they click more, sometimes they click all in the same place, sometimes they click all over the place. So we needed to be able to standardize those. And then second, as I mentioned, we asked questions about the previously existing hotspots that were identified in 2016 as to whether they are still a hotspot or not, or whether the response is uncertain. In terms of the clickable map, again, we used a statistical model to control for how many clicks an individual made, and also to make an inference outside of the specific location someone clicks. Because obviously, if they select a point in one place, they likely actually mean a slightly bigger area. And we can infer that by working across all of the respondents. In terms of the modeling of the hotspot, the pink spots in the map below, what we did was we basically assumed that the responses are in order. So if someone says no, that's at one end of the scale. Someone says yes, that's at the opposite end of the scale, and unknown is somewhere in between. And that allowed us to model essentially the response of kind of how people think things have changed. Obviously, the goal was to estimate whether the location was still a hotspot or not. We also did interviews with experts in the region. We identified experts from their publications, also from the 2016 report and consultation with FAO, and then from other contacts that those people referred us to. It was a semi-structured interview. Again, we asked the respondent, the interviewee, to select one of the 6 regions. After that, we had 2 components. We used a mapping tool as we did in the survey. So we had the clickable map followed by the hotspot scoring. And after that, we had a set of 20 open-ended questions, really asking them about the area they had selected and to pick a specific context within there, and then talk us through the illegal fishing practices in that area, the key ports that are important, vessel types, gear types, drivers, target catch volumes, market prices, and market forces, and then the fisheries management response and enforcement and the efficacy of that response. So those 12, we ended up with 12 respondents across the region with quite varied knowledge. Then the third data source that we need to cover is using publicly available media. So that's a mix of things in popular media and also technical publications and gray literature. Because we're updating the 2016 APFIC estimate, that estimate basically used similar data before 2015. So in order to update it, we started at 2015 and worked forward to 2019. We had 3 sources. There's a large set of media articles that have been put together by Liberty Asia, which is an NGO working in fisheries and labor abuse in the region. We use ProQuest, which is a sort of database of databases, covers about 45 databases to get literature. And then we used a Google News search. We standardized, in terms of data processing, we standardized the searches. We removed all the duplicate records and merged each unique record and collected information on things like vessel, crew, target, catch, value, type of infraction. Again, we use statistical analysis to predict value from the records, which Sean will talk about. And we use catch values were used with the volume estimates, as I mentioned, from the survey to then estimate illegal fishing. The last component was 3 case studies. These were really not designed to be exhaustive reviews, but more illustrative of issues in the region. The 3 case studies included one in Sri Lanka, one in Timor-Leste, and the Sulu Sea live seafood trade. And they really provided a summary of infringement, drivers for the situation, target species, management responses, and a summary of what's going on to date. Really, this was designed as an illustrative exercise to provide some flesh to the data. There's a little bit of concluding components of the study. We summarized the previous reports, compared them with the current study. We identified key issues that had arisen in the region and provided a set of recommendations. I think in conclusion, in terms of the methodology, I think we were able to design something that complements the 2016 report. The outputs are comparable with other estimates. So they use standard metrics like proportion of landings and dollar values. The methods meet the key FAO guidelines. So we triangulate across multiple data types. They're transparent and repeatable. They're data-driven, and they're statistically robust with clear estimates of uncertainty. And I think, as Simon mentioned, the approach really illustrates an inexpensive tool. So the current estimates can be revised if new surveys are done by APFIC members in the existing structure. They can be adapted to be used at the national level. And just in passing, I'll mention that Chile has actually adopted the original system that we developed there, and now doing it as an annual reporting against KPIs. It's actually linked to the Chilean fisheries executives' continued employment, I think. And finally, it can be repeated at the regional level in the future. So 5 years out, if the APFIC members decided they wanted to redo their baseline, it'd be quite feasible. Thanks, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chris. You sort of chewed up all your question time, I have to say, but we are here to learn. I've been tracking the Q&A, and one clear question that has come out is that the approach that was taken looked very much at species. And that was your kind of unit of enumeration or for estimation. One of the questions that has been posed is, can the approach be adapted or used taking a gear focus?
Yes, relatively readily. We chose species because there were FAO catch data at hand to allow us to turn the proportions into estimates of volume and ultimately value. You could just as easily incorporate questions about violations by gear. That would be straightforward.
Okay, thank you. We had one other question, which was this issue of any difference between using the approach at a country level versus using it at a regional level. Is it interchangeable, or do you need adaptations or modifications?
Fundamentally, you could use the approach as it exists for one of the countries in the region. The species lists are appropriate, and all the maps are appropriate and things. If the country wanted to include different questions, say the gear question or different species or things, it's relatively straightforward to modify. It's a matter of just adapting the survey slightly and then shifting the statistical analysis slightly. But there's no major fundamental change, so it would be quite quick.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to ask you to move on to the results, because that's also exciting, and we would like to get into that without further ado. So maybe we can, if you're ready, if I can hand you over hand back to you, please, and to explore the results of this. Yeah, so over to you, please. And yeah, keep an eye on the clock.
Yep, will do.
Thank you.
Okay, in keeping with Simon's comment, I might wind up fairly quickly at the end. So this is just to present the results. I'm really going to touch on 4 key results. Estimating the proportion of landings that are thought to be illegal, characterizing illegal fishing in the focal species, a bit about mapping of hotspots and change since 2016, and then some key results from the media analysis. Obviously, we're summarizing a report that's something like 150 pages long. So if you want more detail, I'd invite you to go to the report. Okay, so in terms of our surveys, we reached out to all the APFIC countries that have EEZs within the area of competence, started from FAO point of contacts with a lot of follow-up. We engaged at the APFIC commission meetings and also at the RPOA. In the end, we were able to get 45 responses, although none in region F. So you can see the 6 regions listed below and the map up the upper right. Essentially,
we can't see your PowerPoint, Chris. Sorry, we're not seeing your PowerPoint.
Sorry. Looks like the screen sharing dropped. I'll be 2 seconds. Visible?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Okay, recap. Outline of the results. Estimate of the proportions of illegal landing, characterizing illegal fishing in the focal species, updating the mapping, and then a few things from the media analysis. Sean's going to talk about the value estimate, so I'll leave that aside. We had 45 respondents. We reached out through the FAO's contacts with the countries. We engaged at APFIC and RPOA meetings. In the end, we were able to not get very much response from region A and in particular region F. So the East China Sea and Yellow Sea are fairly uncertain in the estimates I'll present. We estimated the level of illegal landings for 25 species. As you remember, we started with a set of qualitative categories. This is quite a big slide because it's 6 categories across 25 species. I just want to show you that there are actual quantitative estimates. So that's the probability of illegal landings in each of these categories on the y-axis, and that's the species across the x. In summarizing all that, most species had illegal landings in the little category, so the second smallest. The next most common was less than half. So that's encouraging. Most of the illegal landing estimates are less than half. In terms of the specific species, shark landings ranked the highest, followed by long-tailed tuna, yet albacore and mackerel, which were relatively high. The trochus species were the lowest. 10 of the species had more than a 1 in 10 chance of more than half of their landings being illegal. So I guess the one thing that we capture is not only a point estimate for what we think the level of illegal landing is, but how uncertain we are about it. And so for at least 10 of these species, there's a reasonable chance that illegal landings are fairly high. There was not a major difference in the estimates by region when we compare the region, but the respondents' experience mattered quite a lot in what they said. As I mentioned, we need to turn these categories into quantitative scores, and we use the respondents' answers on these subset of focal questions to do that. So we basically look, did you say a little? And then if you said a little, what percentage did you give us for those 4 species? And from that, we can work out the relationship. So this just shows you the percentages on the y-axis and the categories on the x, and you can see the relationship we estimated. One thing we found was even when people say all of the landings are illegal, they actually, when they give us a percentage, they give us something like 60 or 70%. So I guess that's an example of cognitive bias. We don't always say what we mean, so it's important to be careful with what people say. In terms of mapping hotspots for illegal fishing, from our 45 respondents, we got this map of clicks of where they clicked. I think a few highlights of that are we intentionally didn't show them the 2016 hotspots first. We showed them this blank map and they clicked on it. And so we found a number of places that weren't highlighted in 2016 that had a reasonable number of clicks. So Northern Bay of Bengal, coast of Myanmar, the boundary between the Vietnamese EEZ and the South China Sea, some areas in eastern Malaysia, northern Java Sea, and north of PNG. So in the lower right, you can see the 2016 hotspot map, and here you see the clicks. As I noted, hotspots 32 and 33, which are essentially up off of China, we didn't have any respondents in that area, so we aren't really able to make very good estimates there. For each of these areas, we first did a statistical analysis of kind of what the spatial distribution looked like for region by region. So these maps basically give you a picture of the intensity. The brighter red is the higher intensity of predicted illegal landings from a region. The response is on a log scale, so actually the differences between the high and low spots are quite big. And I just want to mention that what we're actually analyzing is clicks on a map by fisheries inspectors. And so what you're looking at is essentially a proxy for how much illegal landings there are, but the data we're working with is the probability that someone's going to click a position on a map. So it's just a semantic difference, but it's important to keep track of. We then fused all the data together and did an estimate across the region, and this is essentially the spatial pattern you see. So there's essentially a ridge of high predicted illegal fishing going more or less from the upper part of the Bay of Bengal through the area of competence down towards Timor-Leste. And that area is highest between essentially south of Vietnam. As I mentioned, the data selection by officers is on a log scale, so a change in color actually corresponds to quite a big change in intensity. And it's worth mentioning again that it's important to be cautious when you get to the edge of the data. So as you get out towards the Gulf of Oman or off to the northeast of the map, we weren't able to get very many respondents on those boundaries, so we should consider those less certain. Obviously, corresponding to this map, there's also a map of uncertainty in the estimates, and we can provide that. We updated the map of hotspots, as I mentioned. So here's the list of 31 of the 33 hotspots identified in 2016. We couldn't do anything for hotspots 32 or 33 as we had no scores there. It's worth noting that of all those hotspots, when we standardize across the surveys, only one hotspot comes up being scored as no longer relevant. And that's in zone 1, which I think is over off the on the very western edge of the Indian Ocean. All the other hotspots are scored as either still being hotspots or being uncertain. And so the table you see there is the consensus response after standardization and the lower bound and upper bound of uncertainty around that. It's worth mentioning that the uncertainty for those hotspots rarely includes no. So it's basically yes or unsure. And so it appears that not much has changed. I'll touch quickly on the focal species. So I'll present a few different analyses we did. So if you'll remember, for each of those 6 regions shown in the lower left, we asked a series of questions about 4 species, 3 we nominated and 1 nominated by the respondent. So the first question was the percentage landed by species. And you can see there a plot of the percentages species across the X, the percentage landing on the Y, and the regions. So the regions do differ based on these focal species. Some species were high, sea cucumber, again, long-tailed tuna, squid, small demersals. And when we corrected for respondent bias and things like that, the experience of the respondent mattered. So we essentially standardized so that the consensus was based on a coherent experience. We asked about the level of contravention, and I think this may come up when Simon talks about the outcomes. Bilateral contraventions were most common. International contraventions, violations were least common. Violation types obviously differ by species. There's no difference in the violation frequency across these 3 categories, national, bilateral, and international, among the regions. And so this coincides very much with other results in that bilateral management areas appear to be particularly problematic, and they're also associated with borders that appear to be a high risk factor for illegal fishing. We looked at what entities are participating in illegality, so going all the way from fishermen up through their purchasers, processors, wholesalers, onto retailers and exporters. Again, you see species across the X and the probability of involvement in illegal fishing on the Y. This covers each of those 6 regions. Purchasers were far and away the most likely of those entities to be involved in illegality. And so I guess the point of this, and Simon brought this up when we first presented the results, or maybe Robert, how do you get a purchaser that's more involved in illegality than a fisherman? And I suppose the answer is sometimes the fishermen may be landing things legally, sometimes not, at an individual or across a fishery, but the purchasers appear to be deeply involved. All the other entities were lower, substantially lower in terms of their probability of participation. And there were a subset of species that appeared to be most common. So obviously that list includes mammals, small demersals, and squid. There was no interaction between species and entity. So what that is saying is essentially purchasers appear to be most problematic across species, regions, pretty much overall. In terms of types of violations, we looked at a few types of violations: encroachment, breach of license conditions, non-compliant gear, illegal transshipment, and other. Encroachment and breach of license conditions were the most common violations. Gear and transshipment violations were next most common. There was really no difference between industrial and small scale violations. So they had essentially the same distribution in terms of the probability of those different things occurring. The infractions were slightly more common in the industrial fisheries than they were in small scale. But I want to make the point also that in some cases we had relatively low response rates. So for instance, the shark estimates, which look relatively low here, are probably in fact higher. And that's a function of just having relatively few respondents answering all the questions. I'll end with touching on a couple things from the media analysis. I think Sean will talk a bit more detail about this, but I just want to mention a few things. So as I said, we worked across 3 sources of media. We were able to identify 329 unique events in the APFIC area of competence across 23 jurisdictions in that 4-year period. Most of them were within country EEZs, only 25 on the high seas. And really the violations identified there matched the surveys. So encroachment and non-compliant gear were essentially the highest violations. Just a final detail on the media analysis. Most of the reports were on foreign vessels, and one has to be cautious because obviously it's possible that there are reporting biases. It might be easier to report on foreign vessels, for instance, than domestic, for instance. However, 6 of the countries had domestic vessels contributing more than 50% of the value of illegal fishing. So those countries on this plot in this figure, you see the share of illegal fishing value by the domestic fleet. It's marked as IUU, but it should actually say illegal value. And on the x-axis are the countries. And so the countries to the right on that have a larger share of domestic illegal fishing reported. So just to end with a few key conclusions, the hotspots identified in the 2016 APFIC report by FAO remain largely constant. There doesn't appear to be much change in those hotspots. Some new areas were identified and some had fairly strong scoring by the respondents. The volume estimates that came out of the BOBP study coincide fairly closely with the volume estimates made here. So we're consistent with what other people have done in terms of the outcomes. As I've emphasized previously, the methods provide a repeatable, transparent, and relatively inexpensive tool to measure and characterize illegal landings. And I want to turn to the issue of survey response. So the one fundamental challenge we had in this process was getting responses from fisheries enforcement officers within the countries. That was really a key issue. And our experience in Chile suggested that if there's top-down support from senior people in the management agencies, response rates are fairly high, and you can make high quality estimates. So the one recommendation I would make just in terms of the data is if the region goes ahead with this methodology, stronger engagement from the senior officials in the fisheries agencies and promulgation down would improve the data significantly. I didn't touch on the interviews or case studies. Please have a look at the report. Sean will talk a bit more about the analysis of the media to get to value. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Fascinating. We have a few questions. If you would like to field a few questions, it's a bit of a marathon for you. Sorry about that, but just the way it goes. Right. Maybe the first question that came up, and I think it was a very interesting result, that you found that there was no substantive difference between the small scale fishery and the industrial fishery in terms of levels of illegal activity. Can you just sort of explain that? Is that in terms of the overall volume of catch that you estimated from that, or just the numbers of incidences or cases that were identified?
Yeah, so that's in reference to the types of violations, not the volume or the value. So we were asking people how often different types of violations were made by the two sectors. And essentially the answer is encroachment is the #1 violation, whether you're an industrial operator or a small scale operator. The primary violation is encroachment, followed by gear and license issues. The respondents basically said that industrial vessels have overall a slightly higher violation rate, but the probability of the different types of violations, encroachments, illegal gear, license violations, the probability of those different types is the same. So essentially, people break the same rules. The industrial vessels break them slightly more often.
And by inference, simply the larger capacity of those industrial commercial vessels potentially means that they might take more catch, unless the small scale fishery was more numerous.
Yeah, that'll come down to the balance of fishing power between the two. So if you multiply the number of industrial vessels times the size of their troll nets and the number of small scale vessels times the size of their troll nets, whoever's got more net square area wins. But yeah, it could go either way because it'll depend a lot on what the fleet structure looks like.
We've had another question, quick one. Did this approach identify the flag of the vessel committing the alleged infractions, or was that something that was sort of anonymized?
We very intentionally steered clear in the survey of asking about flags, largely due to sensitivities within the audience. So we want to be able to present a study and a methodology that's workable for APFIC that will not raise undue issues with the members. If we don't achieve that outcome, then the study is all for naught. The media analysis, obviously, flags identified in there, and I touched on that very quickly. One could extend the survey methodology to ask about flags if one was interested, but again, that quickly raises issues of conflict amongst countries.
I think that's a really important take home for this regional study, that we tread a fine line between being able to talk about a subject that is extremely sensitive and still actually be able to talk about it without getting tangled up in finger pointing or people denying or whatever the allegations. The main point is to identify what was perceived and considered to be illegal activity in the waters where the respondent was responding. So this is, I think, an important take home for people trying to understand the study. I've had another question here, if you don't mind. It's about whether the hotspots have a kind of quality value. How did you basically what could you get a sense of the amount of IUU fishing or intensity of IUU fishing, the volume of IUU fishing for a particular hotspot from a response? Was that something that could be measured?
So we one could. We didn't try to do that directly. In short, the original APFIC study in 2016 had deeply detailed case studies for every hotspot. So if you look at the end of the document for our study, there's an appendix that includes the vast majority of the APFIC 2016 report with a foreword explaining it. Because the detail was quite deep there, and that's fairly recent, we basically relied on that description of the hotspots. We were essentially just trying to update it. So that said, one could take the intensity maps that we made based on that clickable map and work out kind of how much of the illegal fishing one might allocate to a hotspot. And obviously overall for each species and region, we have a landing estimate. So one could construct that and propagate all the uncertainty through. We didn't focus on it. We could have clearly asked, when we asked people to give us estimates, we could have asked within this hotspot, within that hotspot, that sort of thing. There's always a balance in terms of surveys with people and survey fatigue. So you're trying to hit the sweet spot of asking informative questions that get to what you want without tiring out the respondents and losing response rates.
Okay. We have a few other questions, but I think we'll hold it for now. Oh, sorry, maybe the last one. It's a question regarding the selection of respondents or the people who responded. They were official respondents. The approach was taken to go through the fisheries agencies to encourage their staff to take part. This is obviously an area, as you mentioned with the Chile case study, that if you have very strong buy-in from the fishery agency and staff are basically instructed or requested to take part, clearly the quality and the amount of response you're going to get is going to be much better. So the question was whether the officials who responded were had the practical field knowledge to respond effectively. Were they people who are on the water, close to the water, or were the respondents somehow distant and perhaps occupied a desk job or something like that?
Yep. To some extent we know, to some extent we don't know. So in many cases, say in the Maldives, we had a direct interaction with the head of MCS for the Maldives, and we know that it's his 3 inspectors that responded. So in that case, yes, we know who it was. I guess stepping back, one key question in these sorts of in this sort of work is always to understand your survey population, and that's one of the reasons to target enforcement officers, because A, they have the appropriate knowledge, and B, they're a known population, so you know who they are and how many there are and how to get to them. So as I mentioned in the Maldives, we essentially knew we were hitting the right people. In some of the other countries, we know it was pushed down from the leadership in the fisheries ministry to their enforcement officials. We were quite specific about who we were after, but ultimately, to deal with ethics, we need to be anonymous. And in order to get high honesty, we also need to be anonymous. So we actually don't know. The other context that we ran some surveys was in a workshop where we were delivering some capacity building around MCS tools. So that had three attendees from pretty much all of the APFIC countries, and those attendees were selected from their essentially their national VMS surveillance team. And so even if they were at a desk job, their job is clearly linked to illegal fishing and enforcement. So we're fairly confident that we had the right pool of people. We know who was at that workshop, and those were representative of the countries. And in some cases, we actually know the country respondents just by chance. In other cases, though, they're anonymous.
Great, thanks very much. We have at least one other question, but I think I'm going to leave that to the discussion at the end. It's quite a complicated one. And I'm looking at the time, and would like to move on with the last part of the technical presentation before we move into feedback from our regional organizations. So that moves to the presentation that I will make, and we'll swap over to that now. Let me just do this. Can someone just reassure me that my screen is visible?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've had, oh, what am I talking about? I beg your pardon. Sorry, we're going to have a presentation from Sean Pascoe. That's me getting too excited about this. Sorry, the next step is Sean, who will, and my apologies to you, Sean.
It's okay.
Who will now give us the next.
I thought I got out of it then for a while.
Oh dear. Yeah, at least I don't look like a talking cat. I think that's the latest viral meme of a moderator or presenter screwing up. So sorry. So Sean Pascoe, thank you, and apologies, Sean, will now give us a presentation about how the valuation angle was done in the study. And over to you, please, Sean.
Oh, hang on. I'm trying to work out how to share the screen. Okay. Rightio. So where are we? Okay, as Chris mentioned, I'm going to talk more about some of the economic values we estimated, building on the survey work and also the media analysis. The aim of this part was to try to take the survey estimates that Chris has already talked about, apply that to the FAO production statistics. We also took price information and combined all those to get an estimate of the total value of the illegal fishing in each of the zones. And we also looked at the magnitude of individual legal fishing activities. That was more for the media analysis. And also, Chris already presented a proportion of illegal foreign fishing versus domestic fishing. So I won't really touch much on that. Chris has already mentioned that. But I'll focus more on the aggregated value of illegal fishing in the different regions, and also the sort of individual fishing events and what they can tell us about what's going on. Okay. Righto. So I've already had some sort of presentation from Chris in terms of the methodology to derive the proportions based from the survey of fisheries officers. And from that, we can estimate the average proportion of illegal fishing in each of the regions. And that little top right-hand graph is just a box plot of the distribution of estimates of illegal landings for the different species by the different officers in each of the main fishing regions. So we actually can pick up some uncertainty already in terms of capturing that uncertainty in the estimates from the individual participants in the survey. Total production we took from FAO Global Production Statistics. That was just online, so it was quite handy to get hold of. The price is a bit of a sort of economic magic going on in terms of estimating the price for each of the key species we looked at. We couldn't find a single source that had price data that was relevant for all the species concerned. So price came from a range of different sources, including some of the CFDEC annual reports, which were in that little graph there, the blue columns. You probably can't see the details. That's to give you an idea of we got data from all over the place. Estimates of prices for so things like a lot of the tuna species came from CFDEC. FO trade statistics, where we couldn't get good data from CFTEC. We went back to the trade statistics to look at what the value of exports were from each of the countries we were interested in. And for some of the more sort of obscure species, we found some online trading information for things like seahorses, some of the turtles. We looked online and found sort of markets that were not official markets, but had some sort of trading prices reported. So these came from all different time periods. We had to do a bit of extrapolation in some cases, interpolation others, to produce a time series that was consistent across the species. And we converted all prices into 2019 real terms. So what that means is we took the prices that were from all different sorts of years and used a common inflation factor to bring all those into a common time period, so a 2019 equivalent value, and convert everything to US dollars. So we all had an equivalent unit of currency. Okay. So how do we estimate the catch? The value was two stages. First of all, we estimate the catch. Chris has already touched on this. From the proportion of illegal landings that Chris was able to estimate, we increased, or we inflated the official landings by those proportions to work out the illegal component. So in this case, if the blue column on the right was official landings, and we had, say, I think it's about 20% in this example, estimate of illegal landings, then the total landings would be 120% of what we saw from the official landings, and the IUU was taken, or the illegal proportion was taken as that top bit. So we scaled up the official landings. Given this, we were able to estimate this for each species, for each of the different countries. We worked at the country level and species level for the base landings. We multiplied those by the price in each of the species, and then aggregated those up to the regional level. So we worked at a very disaggregated level initially, and then built up to the more regional level. And that allowed us to get an area level estimate, but also a species level estimate across the whole region. So we had two views of the values. Okay, if I'm going too fast, let me know. Okay, so these are the key results at the regional level, or the sub-regional level. I won't go into detail about these, but we can sort of see that sort of area D, the area around the Arafura Timor Sea, was the largest in terms of both estimated total quantity of illegal landings and also value, nearly $9 billion worth of value from that region alone. Now that column saying RSC, that's a relative standard error. That's a measure of the uncertainty around that mean estimate. So basically for that $9 billion, we have a plus or minus 10% in terms of standard error, which gives you a confidence interval of around about plus or minus 20% if we go to a 95% confidence interval. So we do have uncertainty built in this. We're only presenting the mean values, but there's about a 20% plus or minus uncertainty around that value based on the differences in the estimated sort of proportion of illegal landings. Okay. If we go by species, however, we get quite an interesting picture coming out here. That sort of contrary to popular belief, it's really the low value species that make up the bulk of illegal landings. Sort of fish species made up over half of the total landings and nearly 60% of the total value of the catch of that illegal landing. Now, we don't really know where this is going, but we suspect most of this is likely destined for the domestic market. So it does sort of form part of for food security of regions. So there's a potential trade-off there in terms of, yes, it's illegal, but it's also providing potentially domestic service to the local communities. And in contrast, the high value species that gets lots of the media attention actually contributed quite small proportions to the total value and also total quantity of illegal landings. So it was really your basic food supplies made up the bulk of illegal landings. Other species that were important were shrimp, prawn species, and there were some tuna species that combined made up a reasonable sort of proportion, but were still massively outweighed by the fish species that make up the bulk of the landings and also the value of landings. Okay. Chris has already mentioned some of the other studies in terms of quantities, in terms of how do the values compare. We've already seen that the quantities compare reasonably well to the other studies. It's a direct comparison is a bit difficult. The areas aren't always the same. And also some of the other studies included more than just the eye. We're looking at the eye in the IUU. Other studies looked also at the unreported and unregulated components. A study that Chris didn't mention is a recent one by Rashid Sumaila, which came out last year. And that estimated values of illegal landings in the area of around about sort of 3.8 to sort of $8 billion US illegal landings. Now their methodology was based on trying to reconcile trade data with landings data. So the domestic component of that would be lost from their analysis. So in some ways that is an underestimate of what would be illegal landings in the region because it excludes illegal landings that are basically going to the domestic market and don't actually affect the trade stats. So where our estimates in total were about 23 billion, it was about 3 times that magnitude. We have the domestic market, but also the average price that we used in our analyses that came from those various sources already talked about, worked out an average around about $3 a kilogram on average, whereas the more recent Sumaila estimate worked out about $1 a kilo. So, and that was applied across the board. So they assumed a much lower value of landings. So that was really the big difference in terms of those values, but quantities roughly the same, roughly compatible. Our values are higher, but we also had higher estimates of price from our data. Okay. The second part of the analysis, and Chris touched on this already, is the media analysis, and that was looking at who's undertaking illegal fishing. As Chris mentioned, we looked at media reports across a 4-year period, came up with 329 reported incidents, and the picture on the right is just an example of one of those from the database in terms of Indonesia capturing 26 boats. The key information we extracted were things like sort of where it was caught, where the boats were caught essentially. In most cases, where the boats were from. The catch by species, where we had it. In some cases, we actually had value estimates. In most cases, we had information on the number of vessels and or for crew, which gave us an indication of the size of vessels, and also the gear used. So we're actually able to extract quite a lot of information out of these reports. However, only 27% of the records had detailed information of the catch by species. Some just had a total value, some just had total catch, some just had number of boats. So there was quite a mix of information that we had to work with. So to reconcile all of that information, we looked at, first of all, not looking at their value estimates, we applied our standard prices across everybody. So if there were a difference in regional prices, we took that out to standardize it to get a more of a standardized estimate. And we developed what we call a quantitative regression tree model, and I'll have a bigger version of this in a second. But what this does is this is effectively a very non-linear regression approach that breaks down the data we've got into sort of categories that determine more or less the outcomes from those values. So we ran the regression model with the 27% of data, which we had very good data on, and then applied the results to the other data where we're missing key information. So just to give you a bit of expanded, this still might be a bit difficult to see, but you don't need to know the details. It's in the report. But just to give you an idea of what sort of went into the key drivers of the, in this case, the value of an IUU activity, things like the species that were identified in the report, where it was in terms of for key countries, EEZs that the report came from, things like, again, breaking back down to species, and again by location, and then in some cases the size was important, small or medium. In other cases we broke back down to species, so that we're able to come up with a model that said, based on what we know about the area, the species caught, the size for boats, and who was doing the fishing, we can come up with reasonable sort of estimates of what those values might have been for the remainder of the observations where we didn't have an explicit value estimate from the meter reports. Okay. Now, in terms of what we got out of the data, we found that most countries had multiple reports of illegal fishing, but mostly the very high values were fairly limited to only 1 or 2 cases. Most of the catch was quite low value. Now, we can't really aggregate these because the reports are potentially influenced by sort of what was the media policy of the country in terms of, or the papers in terms of reporting this, but also the surveillance and the enforcement activities within the countries. So a low incident doesn't necessarily mean there's no IUU fishing. It just means potentially that no one was caught, or no one was observed, or that the reports weren't made in the press. Conversely, a very high number of incidents could reflect a really concerted effort of the country to crack down on this. So we can't sort of say, for example, that you know, a country with a higher number of incidents is particularly bad, and a country with a low number of incidents is very good in terms of illegal fishing. It could be related to surveillance, monitoring, and also just reporting by the media. But with that taken on board, we can see places like Sri Lanka had the most reported incidents, but it was also a very low number of, or very low values of incidents. So it had a lot of reporting, a lot of cases observed, but these were also extremely low. Indonesia, in contrast, had quite a high number of reported incidents, but the average value of those incidents were actually quite high. In fact, it was the highest on average. But again, this reports, this could reflect targeting of the activities and also the high value activities by Indonesia. Whereas we also had a very high value, but a very low number, say from East Timor, that had a very high incident, but very, very few reported incidents. Chris presented a graph earlier on with the proportion of who was catching these, and places like Sri Lanka was pretty much sort of very high on for mostly domestic fishing activity. So they had a very high number of low incidents of domestic or low value domestic activity. Indonesia had a very high proportion of foreign fishing. So of those very high values, most of that was on foreign or boats from outside Indonesia who were reporting there, and similarly for East Timor was a very high proportion of foreign activity in those regions. And you can see the other countries, I haven't labelled other countries, they tended to fall in either very low values or very low incidents in the data. Okay. So what can we conclude from all of this? Basically that the the value of illegal fishing could be higher than some of the previous reports have estimated. That could be due to just the fact we're using higher prices, or the higher estimates of prices we had were higher. Or it could be that we're picking up information that was missed in previous reports. And also over half of the illegal catch was from very low value species, very high quantities of very low value species that could be potentially important for the domestic market, and could be being picked up in sort of local food security type, or it could be trade-offs between food security and illegal fishing in some of these countries. Most of the activities we found from the media release were actually very small scale activities. They're not big boats out there sort of raping and pillaging the oceans and catching huge quantities. In most cases, they were a lot of small boats catching relatively small quantities, but lots of them, essentially. There were a small number of very high value activities, but these were the minority in terms of actual numbers of activities. And as Chris already pointed out, and as we found, most of these activities occurred through incursions into other jurisdictions. This again could reflect the priorities of the enforcement officers. They might have been targeting foreign boats more than their own boats. We don't really know. But most reported incidents were through incursions into other jurisdictions. And that's pretty much it from the value side of things.
Thanks very much, Sean. Now, if you will allow us to pose a few questions to you that have come up in the Q&A. I think the first one that we'd maybe like to just sort of straighten out, the prices that you use. You mentioned that some of the other valuation studies had used rather low prices, like Somalia had used like across $1 a kilo across the board. Yep. The prices that you use, these are prices at first landing, right?
They are, for the majority of prices, they are priced at first landing. For some of the species, we used export prices because we couldn't get prices at first landing. So some of those would be a little bit higher than the first landing prices, but that was the best data we could get. We didn't want to, we already had enough sort of extrapolation or interpolation to fill in some of the gaps. We didn't want to start second guessing prices as well in terms of the difference between export prices and domestic prices. So there was some potentially higher price data coming from our use of export values for some species.
And again, picking up on a comment that you made, or rather one of the findings, the clear findings that came out, that the majority of the IUU was, or the legal fishing was around species that are generally lower value, more the regional food fish, and that these are going to be consumed within the countries or between the countries where they're being caught, particularly on this issue of the transboundary aspect of it. That means also presumably then that most of these are not going to enter international value chains that might then be subject to those sort of trade pressures that are used to deter IUU, like the catch documentation aspect, the traceability aspect. This is going to slip under that radar.
Yeah, it's quite possible. We couldn't really quantify how much of that was going to export and how much of it was going to the domestic market. We just assumed, given the nature of the species caught, that most of it would have gone to the domestic market. So, but you're right. If it is going to the domestic market, like we think, then all of those international trade type approaches won't help in this case. Yep.
Right, and that will come up in my presentation shortly as well. This aspect of the need, or let's say that the real solution to a lot of this lies in having some mechanisms between countries in the region to deal with particular hotspots that are problematic, that are worth dealing with, and so that'll be in the recommendations. Let me just have a quick look at the studies. There's a question here. asking whether there is a detailed account of the statistical modeling that was used in the study. Is that going to be in the review? I'm assuming that's because people are interested to try to copy it or to use it or to understand it better. I see Chris is typing an answer, but Sean, do you want to just talk to that?
Yeah, in the economic evaluation component, well, we've tried our best to document the process quite well. We haven't provided the code we used in the report, but I'm more than happy to share that code to people who might want to use it. It was all done in VR software, which is a free software, and we use the fairly standard regression tree models that were applied in this case. We have provided some of the statistical sort of robustness tests of the models in the report, but we haven't sort of provided actual code, but can do if people would like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I think that's just a general message to our audience that obviously this webinar is here not to go into all the absolute nuts and bolts of it all, but to generate an awareness about the report and the review, and also some of the background to the methods, and that please feel free to contact any of us to follow up, and thanks to Sean for his offer to help out if people want to know a lot more about the mechanics of what went on under the hood for the analysis. Okay, I'm still looking at my watch. I apologize, my timekeeping has been shocking this webinar, but never mind. I think we're having a good time. And I'm now going to definitely have a chance to make my presentation. And my apologies to my regional organization colleagues for making you wait a bit longer than you'd anticipated for your presentations. Right, so let me okay, this time. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Simon.
Okay, thanks. So this presentation covers the sort of the recommendations, what comes out of the results and the findings that have been covered now by Chris and Sean of the review. There are some clear recommendations and some clear things that emerge from the study. First of all, some of the first sort of basic findings and caveats, or the overall study that has been the updated study which has been done in this rigorous manner that we've heard, with the a much greater attention to having a sort of a replicable, transparent, scientific approach. It still came up with broadly similar results in terms of where IUU is occurring. Perhaps this is not surprising, since the identified hotspots are these sort of gray areas on boundaries, places that are not easy to patrol, that are maybe a bit distant from key areas where control can be exerted, and so this is an opportunity for illegal activity. A few new areas were found in the study, and many of the areas that were identified as hotspots still have the same drivers behind them. It's the same reasons why things are going on as it was before, and that the species and gears are more or less the same that was found before. And as Sean mentioned in his presentation just now, a great deal of this illegal fish is directed for consumption within the region. It's not likely or it doesn't seem likely that there are very large amounts of this entering international value chains, so beyond the region. So first recommendation is that clearly there is stuff going on, and that there is still grounds for APFIC member countries to take action, to try to look into where illegal fishing is happening, and to try to address this. That it seems that the border issues, and it's around borders where mostly it's happening, that is tricky. It requires bilateral sensitivity. It also means that it's right at the edge of your maritime zones, and of course that is more complicated always. The value and volume is substantial. That's a loss of to the countries. I'm looking at the value there, it says 2.33 billion. I think I might have got a decimal point in the wrong place. Should be 23 billion. And that illegal landings are less than 50% of total landings for 25 species evaluated. This loss of rent is the justification and, if you like, the underlying reason why there is still or should still be interest to take some sort of action to recover that lost rent, but also because this undermines fisheries management. The second recommendation, to establish a transparent, repeatable and cost-effective approach to benchmarking illegal fishing and its effects, and the effects of interventions that are taken to stop this. This is really the purpose of the review of the study and the methodology that's been developed. There isn't an established mechanism for tracking regional improvements and praising national efforts. It's very tricky to show how action has been taken, to measure that and to reward it, or to at least to give recognition to it. One of the reasons is that most countries will tend just to not want to have this advertised, and any kind of mechanism to track illegal fishing could always be seen as a means to criticize or to reveal shortcomings in management. But there's certainly scope to use this nationally, certainly scope to have an internal process to look at how the IUU issue or legal fishing in the country, or that it relates to the country, is taking place and what might be done about it, and also to track any sort of action that is taken. If there was some regional aspect to this, where would we have the institutional home for this? Is there a regional organization that could step up and try to promote training or awareness raising, or possibly even to try to take a regional approach on this? There's clear need still for guidance to countries for their legal and regulatory reforms. A lot of countries are updating fisheries laws and regulations at the moment. It's an ongoing process, but there is a lot of activity going on. But one of the issues that has been identified is that there are disconnects between different parts of the regulatory structures that relate to illegal fishing, whether it's between vessels and fishery law, whether it's how ports are managed, or how customs controls and immigration checks are set. So there is a need really still to come up with some best practice on this, and certainly advice on how countries can take action, and where sensible action can be put in place to improve compliance and reduce these things. And in particular, how to address the disconnections in jurisdiction. This is a major challenge for us as we move into countries trying to implement the Port State Measures Agreement. And these disconnections between inspectors and the different parts of the regulatory framework and the different departments and institutions that are involved with that, where these disconnections happen, it creates opportunities for illegal actions, and particularly, for example, traders to exploit loopholes and to benefit from higher, basically getting legal products and selling them into legal value chains. There's also certainly lessons to be learned between countries on the arrangements for licensing of foreign vessels, for joint ventures, and these other corporate structures that are established that allow vessels that are maybe not owned or beneficially owned within the country to operate. This is something that countries have been taking action on over recent years. But there's still, bilateral arrangements. There's some historic agreements. There are zones also of joint utilization, and all of these things, having the licensing and some degree of control or improved control over that is clearly a need. And this could in itself reduce a level of the illegal activity. There are also examples in the review that identified, for example, where fisheries regulations simply made it impossible for the small-scale sector to operate legally, and therefore they were essentially entirely illegal based on the fishery law, but that no action was taken against that. Now, this is a bit weird because you have a law that is in place, but then you have partial implementation of that, essentially recognizing that this small scale sector is not legal, but at the same time, no action is taken to address that. This kind of thing basically drives non-compliance. It makes part of your fishery basically illegal by its action, which it can't do anything about. And so reform of this kind of issue is something else that can be done. Interestingly, that the violation of international agreements seem less, the species involved and the actions that were in violation of those international agreements, particularly the RFMO stuff. It seems that countries pay more attention to this, and that they are placing more emphasis on their international obligations to RFMOs. But then this other activity on these species that are not covered by RFMO agreements is slipping through the cracks. And that this is an area that could be addressed. There's clear need for enforcement agency to have their capacity built. One of the things or issues that arose from the study was that there is an official perception that IUU fishing, and in this case we use the term IUU, which is a very broad set of issues, is considered a petty crime. Illegal fishing, which is only one component of IUU, by its name is illegal, and therefore it is not a legal action, and therefore does merit some kind of action and sanctions. But by conflating this, putting it all together, in some cases IUU is seen as something that is not worthy of taking action against. And if that's the case, then you run into issues with fisheries agencies unwilling to take action. Maybe they find it difficult to get court cases to stick. There's a lot of issues in how you actually bring a case to court to take action. And also it often opens up, let's say, a tacit justification to turn a blind eye, for example, or even collude with illegal fishers. So there is a need for capacity building programs within the region, within countries, particularly to improve understanding of the fishery regulations, but also to undertake competent inspection and evidence gathering, the kind of evidence that would be required to actually make a court case or a legal action stick, but also to raise awareness and address issues on the collusion and corruption aspect of that. At the same time, there may be also justification to try to see how to improve the oversight of inspection and patrols, so that they are able to work more effectively, particularly around these areas that are considered to be hotspots, where there is quite a high level of activity and also a high volume of catch, illegal catch being taken. There's definitely a need to share, again, experience on the technical aspects of this. The technology is moving very fast. We have moved from just traditional vessel monitoring systems of knowing where a vessel is to having the ability to see on board, eyes on board, with sensors, cameras, that we have very sophisticated systems to handle the different types of data that come in, to manage that, but also to apply rules and even AI to look at where risk and where we should, or to identify non-compliant activity. This is all becoming much more possible in a way that simply was not really something we could even dream of or hope of a decade ago. It's even spreading to the small scale sector. And we are seeing countries interested in this. They're starting to get involved. They're buying systems. They're starting to use these systems. And there's plenty of experience to share on that between countries. In particular, things like how you tender and negotiate for systems. There's a lot of stuff out in the market. Some of it is very good. Some of it may not be very good. How do you ensure that you're getting the best product, that it will link in with other systems, and that in fact you might be able to use or change over your providers at a different stage without incurring huge costs. And also just how you justify paying for this, where you get the money and the resources, and is that something that you get back from improved management? One caveat here is that it doesn't all have to be these high-tech systems. It can be still, a lot can be achieved with effective and competent port inspections and using surveillance on high-risk locations. This may still be the best deterrent and the most effective way to use limited resources. So you don't have to jump to a high-tech solution. There may be simpler, more straightforward ways to work to deal with the most most egregious or the highest risk aspects of illegal fishing. The possibility of developing an information platform. This is probably one of the most tricky or sensitive aspects, the idea of sharing information, whether that is a platform that has very, very high levels of confidentiality or anonymity. But the idea or the suggestion in the report is to look at the possibility of identifying potential hotspots where countries could share anonymized information about the area that just lies along the boundary, so that there's no real issue about where the boundary is, but more to the extent that this is information about activity that goes on in these areas where it's known that illegal fishing is occurring, and it needs some cooperation between the two countries to try to address it. At least the information about vessel locations and what they're up to, and how much fishing they're doing. This allows estimation of costs or potential losses to be established. All of this is something that could be done. Whether or not it would be a regional platform or just bilateral agreements remains to be seen. There are, of course, still tremendous sensitivities to this, but it does offer significant savings or benefits if countries could agree to cooperate, at least on those limited, narrow areas. Bearing in mind also for this region that we have very little true high seas, so almost everything is within a boundary of some country in some shape or form. There was a lot of emphasis on the role of fish buyers and traders. They are, again, one of the greatest players. They are the enablers, and clearly if that can be dealt with or they can be tracked and monitored, there are fewer numbers of them than vessels. They are typically located on shore, not on the water. It is possible then that this is still a way of addressing these issues. We talked about how little of the catch might be going into international value chains. These traders are regional or national traders, but it can still have the same effect if by acting or working with them or ensuring that their activities are compliant, there is a knock-on effect. So they are still one of the groups that could be targeted for specific monitoring or for strengthening documentation and traceability. There is still perhaps reluctance to tackle those traders that are procuring fish from neighboring countries illegally or in some kind of non-compliant manner. That fish is entering national value chains. It may seem to be, well, it's just an opportunity that we've got it, but it's not really something that we can take very strong or effective action against those traders. Again, it comes back to, do you try to tackle the boats or do you tackle the traders receiving the material? In a lot of cases, it's up to understanding how those value chains work and whether or not it's something politically a country wishes to take on board. Another major issue, and this is, I think not very surprising, and that is that a lot of the illegal fishing is driven by the state of fish stocks, and that vessels and fleets are driven to fish on stocks that they are not really supposed to fish on, because the ones where they might legitimately be able to fish are in very poor shape. It means then that no matter how much enforcement is done and how much effort is made to try to stop IUU or illegal fishing, it will still happen either out of desperation or out of economic opportunity, because the fishing profitability of fishing legally is something that is basically not possible for some of these fleets or vessels. They basically have to fish illegally because it's the only way to stay in business. This is a major issue for the region. It's driven by overcapacity. It's also driven by poor control of fleets. But basically, these things have to be tackled in harmony. You cannot just enforce harder. You need also to take all of these other measures as well. And part of this is assessing stocks and having management plans on stocks, start to try to get them into shape so that you then can also have a fishing fleet that has a reasonable chance of operating profitably and compliantly. There were two other recommendations from the 2015 study that are not in the current review or did not come up. This was something that simply wasn't covered by the methodology, but is an interesting addition, and that is that using risk assessment approaches is probably the best way countries can go to look at and understand their illegal fishing activities. The point is, if you have something that's illegal, but it's very, very low volume, and it's occurring very infrequently, obviously it's not a very high risk. And it's also not going to be worth spending a lot of money, a lot of fuel and patrol boat time to try to tackle it. So the risk assessment allows the identification of serious issues that require action and that can be dealt with in a relatively cost-effective way. Second thing, again, is that this issue of having awareness across agencies. It's not just the Department of Fisheries, it's all of those agencies that are effectively competent in the maritime domain. And I mean, on one country case, we ended up, I think, working with 8 different agencies at one stage, all of whom had some connection to how fishing vessels operated, landed, or were controlled either on the water or in port. And so this just gives an idea of having this understanding and a common understanding of what constitutes legal or illegal activity across those agencies, and also where their competencies start and stop. Having that fairly clear is also a critical aspect. With that, thank you very much. I will open up to questions if you want to put questions in the Q&A, or I would even put something to my panelists if they have any questions to me on that. I'm not getting that, so I'm not going to waste time waiting because we have potentially time at the end. And also, I'm conscious that we've overrun quite considerably. So in that case, if you do have questions, please put something into Q&A, and we'll try and answer those at the end. But now I'd like to move over to invite the Regional Plan of Action IUU, Pak Arif Hidayatullah from RPOA, please, to give your institutional perspective and feedback on this. Pak Arif, please.
Right. Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to express my gratitude to the FAO-APFIC for inviting us to provide some thoughts on the review of IUU fishing in the APFIC region. Of course, it's an honor for us, an appreciation and big thanks also appropriately addressed to INFOFISH for organizing this event. And please note that my presentation is a view from the Secretariat of RPOA-IUU. Therefore, there is a possibility that our participating country have their own view about the research. Right, without further ado, here is the outline of my presentation. First, we would like to give a brief overview about the RPOA-IUU. In this part, we will also provide information on how we track progress combating IUU fishing in the region. Then our comments on the research, and the last is our recommendation. Next. RPOA-IUU was established in May 2007, consists of 11 participating countries, and now we are on progress to invite Myanmar and Laos to be the new participating country of RPOA-IUU. Thank you to the FAO, APFIC, INFOFISH, SIFDEC, and WorldFish for your support as the advisory bodies of the RPOA-IUU. Please back to the previous. RPOA-IUU is a voluntary non-binding multilateral that has function to promote responsible fishing activities in the region of ASEAN plus Australia, Timor-Leste, and PNG. Therefore, although voluntary in nature and self-funded by each participating country, RPOA-IUU has a very important role as a bridge of communication between ASEAN and its neighbor in articulating efforts to combat IUU fishing. Next. These are the 11 core elements of RPOA-IUU. As a persuasive and participative means, we collect information and promote some of key factors in combating IUU fishing. We put these core elements into the RPOA-IUU work plan, then we also evaluate the implementation of the work plan. Next. Talking about the progress we have, as you can see on this slide, almost all of RPOA-IUU participating countries have ratified FAO PSMA and other international instruments. For MCS activities, our participating countries develop their national fisheries legislation and program to fight against IUU fishing, and we really appreciate for this progress. Another good progress is there is no vessels of RPOA-IUU participating country list in IUU vessel list of relevant RFMOs. Next. Yes, I've mentioned this, that almost all of our participating members already ratified international instruments. Next. Yes, so this is, as I mentioned before, that our participating country shows their good progress in terms of coastal state responsibilities. So as mentioned before by Simon, we have informal means of information sharing and data about IUU fishing suspected vessel movement. And we right now developing TOR for the data sharing mechanism. Regarding the flag state responsibilities, as I mentioned before, there is no our participating countries vessel list in the IUU vessel list. And also in the regional market measures, our RPOA-IUU participating countries considerably have implement catch documentation SIM or e-logbook. Next. RPOA-IUU also continually collaborates with RFMO. For example, we circulated information from RFMOs regarding suspected IUU fishing vessels to all RPOA participating countries as an alert to prevent those vessels from entering any port of our participating countries. So in this slide, as you can see, next slide, please. Okay, in this slide, shows the current condition of IUU fishing in the RPOA-IUU area. This slide shows that emerging issue in our region is the encroachment, destructive fishing, and violation against conservation measures, which also precisely spotted in the finding of the research. Hence, we consider the research is accurate and credible and very useful for us as a significant information to develop pathway of combating IUU fishing in RPOA-IUU region. However, before we continue to provide some notes regarding the research, we would like to inform you that some of sub-regional working group in the RPOA-IUU have initiated and developed solution for this concern. For example, in the Gulf of Thailand, they have collaborative fisheries management among states involved in the area. Another example is the ATSI sub-regional. They conduct joint inspection in targeted waters. Next, please. Yeah, next. Now is our thought on the study. Just like we mentioned before, the report of the research demonstrate a very high quality of research. So, so much same conclusion with the data that we receive from our participating country. Next. Yes, this the expansion of the location of research to all of the APFIC area of competence shows the eager and passion of the APFIC to maximize its contribution to its area of competence. And next, to support this, please allow us to give some points regarding the methodologies that might be useful. First, we acknowledge and would like to compliment the research team of APFIC and CSIRO that have elaborated the robust and comprehensive methodologies in this research. However, as the nature of research that always open for improvement and development, here are our notes. Firstly, we understand that some of methods used in the research are surveying and interviewing fisheries officer. So regarding the survey, we propose some question to be included in the future studies, such as what, how, and the extent of the stock and environmental recovery measures applied. This kind of information we think will useful for predicting the degree of the impact of IU fishing and the possibility of recovery, especially for us in providing advice regarding the measures that need to be developed further to our participating countries. And the second, regarding the interview, we understand that collecting information from the fisheries officer will provide us a very useful and reliable data to estimate the extent of IU fishing in the region. However, if we also include information from fishermen, especially the small scale, will feed us the more complete information, particularly to estimate the undetected, as mentioned before by Simon and San probably. There are some IU fishing activities that are still not detected. So by interviewing the small scale fisheries, will improve the information that we get. Therefore, for future research, we suggest that including small scale fishes as responded for both survey interview will be very useful. The third is regarding media analysis, as previously mentioned by Sen also. We underlining the possibility of political bias regarding the media, even can be generalized. However, sometimes media reporting some news based on particular political agenda. Okay, next. That were some of our comments regarding the method. And next, we also present here some general recommendation for future study. In this slide, we provide some variable that need to be researched in the future in order to tracking the extent of IU fishing and its impact. First, I think it's important to research how the eco label certification process conducted. And the second, very important for us to know the potential conflict between local fishermen and how to understand recovery and this restoration efforts that have been done and developed. And next, the categorization of small-scale fishermen. I think it's very important because some of different understanding regarding the categorization of small-scale fishermen makes it difficult to deter the IU fishing by small-scale fishermen. And then the joint development, we need to research the possibility of cooperation between a state that has jurisdictional shared borders. And then we need to continue develop the research regarding the fishing gears innovation, because the abandoned species, as mentioned in your research, it's still high. So we need to continue to develop the fishing gear to reduce the abandoned species. Next. Yes, finally, our recommendation. We hope that the FAO-APFIC would strengthen its support and collaboration with us, the RPOA-IUU. We also, as mentioned by Simon before, that it's very important to give extensive training to the fisheries inspector and official. So we propose that FAO, APFIC, and also CSIRO to increase its support to give more training or workshop to the our participating country fisheries inspector and official. And the last but not least, we support FAO, APFIC to disseminate these research results and recommendation. And if it's possible, please provide interesting, eye-catching, yet informative material such as flyer, brochure, etc. That would be great. I think that's all from us, and thank you for your attention and time.
Thank you very much, Pak Arif. We've had one question. Maybe we can take it at the end. I'm conscious of time. So Pak Arif, if you don't mind, I'll move to Dr. Warwick, please, from CFDEC. Thank you very much. Dr. Warwick, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon from Bangkok to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer, FAO, Dr. Simon and his staff to invite CFDEC. As far as CFDEC is the technical institution, we are not so my comments or feedback to the study is more on the technical aspects. For your information, CFDEC member countries who are the members of APFIC is about 1/3 of them. About 8 countries are members of APFIC. It's not all. Totally, we have 11 member countries of CFDEC. So congratulations on the launching of this research finding through CFDEC. Task given to CFDEC today is to give the feedback to the review. My first point I want to raise here is that I will not touch on the methodology because you clearly mentioned in your documents that you have agreed methodology that you use for this research. However, we found, I observed that in the review you made, for those secondary data that you use, for instance, the bilateral arrangement between countries, fishing gear definitions, national legislation, political clarity, and some sort of secondary data that you use for the review in this document, you may need to verify or to revisit the correctness of the data and information you used.
Dr. Warith, sorry for the interruption. Do you want to share your screen, please?
Yes, later on I can.
Okay, okay, thank you very much.
Because my slide will show the audience only the way forward that we have obtained from last year, our teleseminar on IUU fishing in the region. Thank you for reminding me. Where am I now? The secondary data that you use for the review, if possible, could you please check the correctness of the data and information you use? I think many of them are not so updated because you are still using some information. For example, the what they call bilateral arrangement for allowing foreign fishing vessel to fish in the EEZ of one country. I think in CFDEC member countries there is no more bilateral arrangement for those foreign fishing vessels to fish in their own water. That's for example. And I saw some of the errors or corrections in the document, and I already sent my comments to the FAO and APFIC and the team. I think that for their consideration to revisit and review my comments from CFDEC. What I would like to address is that the hotspot, the implication of information on hotspots that mentioned in the review. I don't want to touch on the methodology or the method that you are using the interview, but you said the respondents number 40 something, but you have covered 21 countries under APFIC region and member states. I think in the future, if you want to repeat this kind of methodology, you may consider to increase the number of the respondents, and the way of using the interview and the view or experience or knowledge from the respondents are really critical to me. I think the things that you have to consider in the future is to whether to improve or increase the number of the respondents in terms of knowledge and experience of those you interview. Some information that I would like to suggest is the price of the value of the illegal catch that presented. I think FAO can revisit that part again. If you use the figure or the value that you presented for the value to 2019, maybe you can make use of your FAO statistic, because CFDEC has only 2017 data on the price. It's not really you mentioned in the review. And surprisingly, when I go through the documents, I saw a bit useful information to CFDEC member countries where, for example, sharks, more than 50% of sharks landing in the APFIC region are considered illegal catch. Over the years, I saw a number of countries in CFDEC member countries improve a lot in terms of fisheries management, where I think the illegal landing of those high value or endangered species are not really reflect what information we share among our ASEAN member countries. Also, tuna species that indicated in the review, from my knowledge, most of the tuna landed in our CFDEC ASEAN member countries are really legal, not high level of that. We can take note on that, and then we work in the future how to make use of this kind of data for our member countries. Yes, now I try to share the screen. Can I ask the organizer to put my screen on?
Okay.
Thank you.
After, could you please share screen?
because okay, thank you. Can you go to the second one? Okay. Yes, I would like to address to all of us here is that the fundamental elements for eliminating IUU fishing for ASEAN and SafeTech countries are including on the slide. This kind of elements is more or less in line with those we heard from FAO and the finding from the review. What I would like to inform you is that now ASEAN member states are in the progress of establishing an ASEAN network to combat IUU fishing, where they have formulated a number of a series of activities towards establishment of this body, where information sharing on IUU fishing activities can be made through that ASEAN mechanism. And also, I think the information from the review on the hotspots can be useful for that fora. And next month, early March, they will have the third ASEAN meeting on the IUU network. Maybe later on, our ASEAN member countries ASEAN member states can share us the result, what kind of the progress so far. Yes, a number of issues here are aligned with those cooperation, collaboration between countries sub-regionally or bilaterally, transparency of sharing information between states, law enforcement capacity building, and how information and mechanism to cope with such kind of problem and issues, and also the importance of having capacity development program for the region. Next, please. Yes, this information are obtained from our last teleseminar conducted between SafeTech and member countries at national level. The national level, yes, sorry. Yes, the way forward at national level includes strengthening countries' capacity, I think in line with those on the MCS program, flag states, coastal state, and post-state responsibilities, as well as market state to combat IUU fishing. Applying a new technology or a kind of cost-effective for the MCS program, and enhance and improve capacity of the countries on the PSM or PSMA to implement appropriate fisheries management to cope with this issue. The traceability system also another issue that countries are requesting SafeTech and other partners to help developing a traceability system appropriately for their own respective countries. Last but not least, yes, of course, the cooperation, collaboration among people, among countries, among states, and those international regional organizations are required. Next, please. This is my last slide. The way forward for the regional level, as discussed last year. We are requested to looking at the strengthening global regional information exchange program. SafeTech will support technical aspects to ASEAN and other collaborative partners, try to help not only ASEAN member states, but to share our experience to the international fora or regional fora. The next one is enhancing collaboration between organizations, as I mentioned earlier. And yes, just you had heard about the presentation from RPOA-IUU. They have their own system or program on watch list. SafeTech, where we have the regional fishing vessel record, where the countries can share information on the vessel in their own countries, not the IUU fishing vessel, but those who register and legal fishing vessels. Now the program of IFVI is ongoing. The country is also requesting how best the electronic system of catch documentation can be improved and harmonized, whether if appropriate. And also keep in touch, supporting ASEAN mechanism on the establishment of ASEAN network on IUU fishing. Yes, that's all the information I want to share to the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, CFDEC, Dr. Warowit. And it's great to see so much alignment between CFDEC and the RPOA, but also that the recommendations that are coming out from your process are broadly in line with the recommendations and findings of the review. So I take that as a very promising thing. Some of the comments regarding the data, whether it's out of date or not, I think we do take that on board. Certainly, some of the 2015 study data, of course, was referring back to even 4 or 5 years prior to that. So I think this is all clearly stated that this is back at the time, and that is in an annex. It's not the current situation. Now, if I may move to Dr. Yadava, please, from Bay of Bengal Program IGO for your comments. Dr. Yadava, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Good afternoon and good evening. First of all, let me thank APFIC for inviting the Bay of Bengal program to this very important webinar on the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Although the topic of discussion is only illegal, the UU are out of the radar at the moment. I would also like to thank the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization for the excellent document, and of course, INFOFISH for the organization of this webinar and keeping us awake day and night, and keeping us informed about this webinar so that we don't lose track of this webinar in the tsunami of webinars that we are having in the recent period. So with this, I would like to make a brief presentation on the report, and I would also like to share my presentation on the screen. Is the presentation clear?
Yes, if you could make it presentable.
Or should I put it on the full screen?
Please, presenter mode. Yeah, full screen.
Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is a review of the document, basically on the illegal fishing in the APFIC region. And the focus here would be on the Bay of Bengal sub-region. We have perused the report, and we find that the report has 3 overlapping parts. The first is on data collection, the second on the data cleaning, and the third part is on the analysis and findings. And these parts are presented together. And, we had to read it repeatedly. So I must confess that the reading was a bit difficult. And since this document at the end of the day would also go to the APFIC member governments, and we feel that as a policy brief, the findings may be presented separately. The highlights of the report, the first, it indicates high levels of illegal fishing near borders, in shared zones, and in disputed waters. The report also talks about frequent violation of bilateral agreements, particularly where there is asymmetry between parties. It talks about the prominence of fish buyers or purchasers in illegal fishing, the likelihood that many of the violations documented were related to stock depletion and profitability, the lack of alignment in regulatory systems and industry structure as a key factor leading to illegal fishing, and the role of international management regimes in reducing illegal fishing. Some of the strengths of this study in the context of IUU fishing in the Bay of Bengal region. So we saw that the report has two main objectives. One was updating the 2015 APFIC report on illegal fishing, and in the process also developing a sound and replicable methodology. The major achievement of the report is the scientific estimation of the extent of the IUU fishing in spite of limited information. As many speakers before me mentioned about the number of respondents, 45, which is considered to be inadequate. So that's where we mentioned limited information. It is estimated illegal fishing in the Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea, and the Gulf of Ireland at the estimated stands at about 1.55 million tons. And illegal catch is the third largest catch from the Eastern Indian Ocean region, which is about 20% of the total catch from the region in the year 2018. And it also highlights the fact that this is a direct loss to the countries, and suitable management measures can plug these losses to a large extent. The graph on the slide, it depicts the 10 countries fishing in the Indian Ocean, Eastern Indian Ocean, and the volume of catch that comes from these 10 countries. Coming to the weakness of the report, we find that much of the weakness stems from the lack of information, and it's been highlighted before me by many participants, speakers. There was limited participation in the direct survey. Quality of the information is not consistent in some cases as per the report. In terms of replication, we feel it will be difficult due to information constraint. However, we also feel the methodology for data collection is easy to implement, and countries in the APFIC region may be encouraged to adopt and report them. The data consistency part will require expert assistance and may be carried out at the regional level at regular intervals to create indices. And we also feel that the lack of information can be related to the absence of monitoring, control, and surveillance divisions in some countries. Talking about the Bay of Bengal program member countries, the national MCS plans were developed during 2008 to 2010, and these MCS plans were once again reviewed in 2018. And subsequently, the national IUU plans have also been developed through the BOB-LME and BOBP-IGO coordinated projects. And I'm sorry to say that except Sri Lanka and Maldives, the other countries are still in the developmental stages and their plans are not yet fully functional. I would like to show here the IUU index, which has been picked up from a study by Poseidon, 2019 study, I believe. It's an independent assessment of country performances showing the Bay of Bengal countries which are at the halfway mark. So we have all the 8 Bay of Bengal countries over here, and we have picked up few parameters which relate to coastal state, flag state, port state in general, and the overall picture. So you would see that we are at the Bay of Bengal countries are almost at the halfway mark. In some cases, some countries are showing a better performance, but on the whole, the mark is at the halfway. And coming to some of my last slides, the approaches to curb IUU fishing in the BOBP region. I mentioned that in 2008, through the Chittagong resolution, the Bay of Bengal program countries had adopted the fisheries monitoring, control, and surveillance. And The Chittagong resolution was subsequently developed into the national MCS plans during the period 2008 to 2010. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Plan of Action on IUU has been adopted by Maldives and Sri Lanka. The other two countries are yet to do. It's under review in both Bangladesh and India. And I mentioned earlier that a regional plan to improve the MCS was once again adopted in 2018. And we hope that there would be now a better progress on implementation of the MCS in the country. And also a regional plan of action on curbing IUU fishing has been developed in assistance with FAO and is currently under technical review. Final thoughts. We feel the report has come out at an important juncture as countries are striving to meet the targets of SDG 14 and also the WTO fisheries subsidy matters, where IUU fishing is one of the key issues. For full understanding of the scope and extent of IUU fishing in the region, the data may be reported at the national level in the future, and comparisons can also be drawn with other indices such as the Global IUU Index and the Ocean Health Index. And repeating what I said earlier, BOBP-IGO and FAO are working with the member countries to develop a regional plan of action to curb IUU fishing. CFTEC has already done. And once the BOBP-IGO member countries also fulfill this, then we would have a regional plan of action which would be bay-wide. With this, I conclude my presentation. And once again, thank you for inviting the Bay of Bengal program to this very important webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bay of Bengal Program IGO, Dr. Yadava. I'm painfully aware that I've overrun my timekeeping by 40 minutes. We don't have any standing questions in the Q&A box. We've been answering them, and the panelists and presenters have been busily typing in responses to your questions and queries through the webinar. So I'm inclined to close on this note, thanking all of the last three presenters for their inputs. And I think this is really helpful feedback. This review was always intended to be a kind of exploratory activity to see if it was possible to get some sense out of something that is almost invisible and certainly is not publicized and widely available, not the sort of thing that there are structured measurements and data collection built around. And I think the review has proven that, and your responses to that underline that. Of course, you highlighted some of the weaknesses. We certainly need more people to respond if we're going to use this kind of approach. But I think the intention was to show proof of concept, and that we can get usable information out of it and get at least a better handle on what's going on and where. And hopefully that we've inspired all of you to start thinking about using this kind of approach. This is something that can be done within modest budgets using the existing resources that countries have at their fingertips, which is a big body of competent fishery officers that are capable of responding and taking part in this kind of survey. Some of the modeling and some of the more complicated statistics, well, that will probably need some support and guidance and training on. And if there is interest, let's talk about that and see how we can move that forward. If there are countries or organizations that are interested, I'd certainly encourage you to reach out to CSIRO. These guys have done amazing work in pulling this together, and they are, you know, very, very competent in this arrangement. And I'm sure, and I'll hand over to Chris and Sean in a minute, I'm sure they will be delighted to, you know, to follow up and to have further contact with you on this. So maybe I can just hand over to Chris and Sean briefly, to you. Sorry, put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It was very useful feedback coming from the various other regional bodies. We certainly recognize the limitations in response rates. Clearly, that's an issue, and I can't tell you how many hours our staff spent chasing chasing people across the APFIC region. So I think that in some sense is as Simon said, a question of demonstrating that it's a useful method, and then revisiting essentially the political discussion with the senior officials in the fisheries agencies. We would certainly welcome anyone who's interested in the methodology, either applying it in this region at the national scale or elsewhere. We're certainly in discussions about using it in other contexts. I will list a URL where you can see more information about the work and other related work. And we welcome people to get in touch with either us directly or through the FAO office and APFIC Secretariat. It's been quite interesting, and I think it has a lot of promise. So if there's enthusiasm from the APFIC members, we would definitely welcome the opportunity to keep working and improve the approach and estimates. Thanks, Simon, and thanks everyone.
Okay, thanks. Can I just add to that also that thanks everybody for their useful feedback. As Chris pointed out, this was an attempt to do something different that was potentially replicable across the region. We take the point that there weren't a lot of people involved in the initial study, but what was quite reassuring was even in that case, we still came out with estimates that were pretty much consistent with other approaches that were much more complicated. So the simple approach seems to be getting us in the right ballpark in terms of the quantity. Now we can improve on the data. Some of the other data we had to sort of dig around for, and at a national level, we'll probably be able to get much more detailed data that's more relevant to each individual country. So it's a first attempt at what could potentially be a very useful tool for the region. And as Chris said, we're more than happy to keep working in this area and maybe work with you in the future to try to refine these methods and come up with even bigger and better, or maybe not bigger, but maybe better estimates, smaller and better estimates of illegal fishing.
Fantastic. Thanks to both of you for all your hard work on this, and also for agreeing to be presenters today. And thank you also to our three colleagues from the regional organizations also for giving up your time and spending time to look at the review and give us that valuable feedback. Finally, thank you very much to INFOFISH for helping organize this webinar, making this all possible for us. We've had a very good turnout. We're delighted that we're able to get this out to as many people as we can. I've just seen a comment, sorry, it's just come in. Apparently, Chris, your web link is wrong. That's probably because you got 2 E's in research. So can you retype the link, please?
Yes, just done.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so finally, just a big thank you to Shirlene and her team from INFOFISH. Big hand to you. Thanks for all your arrangements. Thank you to my FAO colleagues, Robert and Susanna. And I wish you all a very good evening or a good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope that this has been valuable. Thank you so much.
Hold on.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we have some feedback, something to do.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was, yes, I beg your pardon. Before you hang up, there is a poll that INFOFISH want to run a poll. Thank you very much for reminding me. INFOFISH, can you pop the poll up? I was expecting it to come automatically. Would you mind to fill this in before you depart? And we want to get as many of you as possible. You can't leave until you've done the poll.
Simon, it appears to be frozen on my screen.
That's because panelists and presenters are not allowed to answer the questions. You might be biased.
Ah, yes.
There are only 4 questions to answer to. It shouldn't be too stressful.
I mean, I was trying to click and I think you clarified.
Which was your favorite presentation?
John, I just have a quick question for you, if you don't mind. Quite a large portion of the fish landed was low value.
Yep.
But I think more than 50%, if I remember. So, but we use the price of $3 per kilo. So how much did this skew the total value of the IUU in all?
Well, it's a good question. The actual price that that fish would have sold for, especially if it went on a domestic market, we don't know for sure. But it was half of the quantity and about half the value. So it would have actually increased the total value. Well, I guess if you say half, if the prices were, if the actual true price is half of what we've used in the analysis, then we're probably sort of rough estimate, maybe 25% overestimating the total value of IUU. So we're not doubling it. We're taking half of a half in terms of the potential overestimation. But without better information, that was as good as we get. We couldn't make up the numbers. We had to get them somewhere. Yep.
So maybe there should be a sort of in the estimation a low figure and a high figure rather than just the one figure of the 23 billion.
We do in the table. We have confidence intervals, but that's to do with uncertainty around the quantities. The price, we don't have a confidence interval around those because we only had one estimate of, well, we had estimates of prices for each of the individual species, but for some of the sources, they might not have been the prices that the fishers were getting. And fish might have been one of the key ones where we've got a too high a price, but we had no alternative source. So there's no uncertainty in terms of alternative values we could have tried. There's just no information.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
Just something that you have to think about for the next.
Yeah, round. And if we get better price information in the future, that would help improve the estimates. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody.
Everybody.
I can let you all go now. Thanks so much. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And
yeah, thanks, Simon. Thanks, Charlene, and thanks,
Thank you,
John, and other friend, and Robert. Yes.
Dr. Warwick,
just a long time.
Arif,
just reminded me, Happy New Year. Happy Chinese New Year.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Lovely
Thanks,
webinar. Yeah.
Okay.
See you
Thank
again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Well done.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
All the best. See you.